Okay, let's move on to some basic environmental concepts. You're not going to find these in the book. These are actually sort of collected together because it seems like a good place to have them. Key thing to remember with almost all environmental issues is there's both short-term and long-term, short-term benefits and cost, long-term benefits and cost. And when you're looking at this whole discussion about how to deal with environmental issues, it's very important to keep in mind what those are, and if they're not being presented, then why not? So environmental issues, key thing to remember is, again, what's the perception of the issue and how different groups approach it. If you think your Chinese coal pollution issue, there's short-term cost benefits for both stopping the coal-fired plants and its impacts economically versus death tolls. And you end up in going back to commodification. If you think about it in a rather grim way, it's how much is the economy worth versus how much 1.6 or whatever million lives it is that die each year from pollution. Because that's actually what you're looking at. You're looking at what's the cost benefit of this and the impact versus the cost benefit of that and the impact. And many of you point this out in your reactions, and this becomes how you have to make the call, how you make the judgment. So when I look at environmental issues within this larger concept, it goes back to what we were talking about the last couple of times. Greenhouse effect, this should be pretty straightforward. Most of the stuff you probably have seen since you were in grade school, since environmental issues are much more part of the American educational system than they used to be. Greenhouse effect just means that what you're doing is you're basically manipulating, or somehow the upper atmosphere is changing and the amount of UV coming through changes. So either you bounce more UV off as you end up with particulates in the high atmosphere, which means the less heat and stuff comes down to the planet, so that the planet cools. The other version of this is that the particulate pattern and the UV layers change, or I should say the atmosphere layers change, and more of a UV gets down to the ground and the planet heats up. More accurately, what usually happens is not so much the planet heats up directly, but the ability of heat to escape is modified by virtue of atmospheric changes. We oftentimes call this a greenhouse effect, which is based on, of course, the idea of an actual thing used in planting for flowers and stuff, a greenhouse. And this is a huge part of this whole issue. Oftentimes now has been spun into global warming, though they're not exactly necessarily the same thing. Global warming is a very, very complicated concept when you actually get down to what it consists of, which also means that, of course, then modifying it becomes a lot more complicated because you've got a lot of different factors in place simultaneously. Greenhouse effect is a little more straightforward because what you're looking at is upper atmosphere impacts, whether it be pollutants in terms of particulates, whether it be changing amounts of ozone in the upper atmosphere due to discharges of various gases or whatever. That the greenhouse effect is fairly straightforward. Fixing it isn't, but in terms of what it is, it's fairly straightforward. The whole idea of global warming is a much more complicated issue. Air pollution, you saw that in the video. Air pollution, again, appears fairly straightforward, and this actually gets one of those classic examples of, again, which is you can watch the video, is this whole issue of a balance. What we basically usually call these cost-benefit analysis. What are the costs if you do this? What are the benefits if you do that? And if you're in government or any sort of environmental situation, that's invariably what you're doing, is some sort of cost-benefit analysis. Because there's going to be, almost for anything that you do, any modifiable change, there's going to be a cost attached to it. And then it gets back to what are the benefits attached to it. And of course, going back to commodification, usually the benefits and the costs get weighed in some sort of economic form. How much money you're going to save, how much it's going to cost, et cetera, et cetera. So air pollution is basically, again, particulates in the atmosphere. Probably most subtle of these is your acids. We see this a lot here in Hawaii when Kilauea goes up, because you have to remember that air pollution isn't necessarily a human phenomenon. Mother Nature is very good at generating enormous amounts of air pollution. So if Kilauea erupts, then it generates enormous amounts of hydrosulfides into the atmosphere, which when they rain down to the earth, come down as sulfuric acid, which is one reason why if you're on the Big Island, you generally can't get coverage for the paint on your car. Because for most of the folks in the Big Island, when the rain comes down, it's got sulfuric and it eats right through the clear coats, and your paint coverage, your car gets damaged real quick. So that's a side effect of air pollution. So it's not only necessarily particulates that go into your body, it's also various other impacts. And of course, this has impacts on things like certain types of plants. There's some stuff that you can't grow on the Big Island downwind of Kilauea. simply because those particular plants can't handle an acid environment, especially a hydrogen sulfide or sulfuric acid environment. So they won't survive there. For other plants, they actually like that. So, that's going to modify that. So air pollution, again, is a fairly straightforward concept. I'm sure you've seen it since you were a little kid. But the mitigation part, or what is air pollution? How do you mitigate it? That becomes a lot more complicated. This gets back to this idea of cost-benefit analysis. Photochemical smog acid hazardous deposition, that's what I just mentioned. The idea of sustainable development, this is a huge rhetoric right now. The state is basically committed itself to the idea that we're going to have a sustainable state by 2050. From a geographer's standpoint, that means you're going to have to get rid of about 80 to 90% of the population, because the actual sustainable land area, which is constantly shrinking due to especially subdivision development, is rapidly disappearing. The amount of land available to generate food is incredibly small. And you have to remember that, especially on Oahu, but also Maui, a large part of your agricultural land is used by large corporations like Monsanto for the purpose of generating GMO plants. So those plants are seed plants that are then shipped around the planet. So none of that stuff stays here, and you're not even supposed to eat it. It's generating food sources like seed corn somewhere else on planet Earth. So the idea that you guys basically take X amount of, square meters or acres or whatever, and make the island self-sustaining, sounds good, and people love the concept, I think, in some sort of vague way, but the actual cost-benefit analysis is sort of mind-blowing. Of the population of this class, since there's 20-some people in this class, that means 19 of us would have to leave. And if other places are going to sustainable, where are you going to move to where they have room for you in a constantly increasing global population, if they too are concerned about sustainability based on their own resources? So sustainable development sounds fantastic, and people love the idea, especially on an island, that you basically can sustain yourself on your own resources. But this goes back to political ecology. It's a classic example of political theater. The reality of it is it's not viable in any way, shape, or form. And I have a hard time understanding why. I can see the state committing to a more sustainable state, but the idea that you're going to have self-sustainability in roughly 25 years, if you're looking for a career, hey, if you can figure out how to do that, you're going to be worth a ton of money. Biodiversity, this is an enormous issue. This also sort of spins off into what I'll eventually get to and pull down the road with the idea of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. Biodiversity is the concept and the premise that the more diversity you have in terms of the variety of plants and animals that exist in an environment, the more flexibility that gives you to deal with things like change. And there's a ton of evidence that supports this. The Hawaiian environment here was on one hand pretty diverse, but it was also very trapped in the sense that a lot, especially the birds, for example, were so specialized that they could only survive on a particular species of plant, or maybe one or two species in a particular environment. And if anything happened to that environment, then the birds went extinct. So biodiversity, one of the main premises of biodiversity is the more diversity you have in your animal plant species, the better you can handle environmental changes. Now, the problem we get into, of course, in the 21st century is between agribusiness, or as we'll see, commercial agriculture, the idea, again, of commodification, which of course also has to do with things like scale. The more acres you put into coffee, the more money you can make, because you now have economy of scale. That also means there's now less diversity, because that whole landscape, which might have been a bunch of different stuff, is now just coffee. So biodiversity is something that we have moved away from in the 21st century to an enormous extent globally. And it's really coming back to bite us. Because if you don't have that diversity, then you're expecting the animals and the plants that you've got to somehow make physiological change in short periods of time as environmental change occurs. And that's just not the way that evolution works. So biodiversity is a rather it's a very simple premise, but it's a very complicated, when you actually start, the rubber hits the road type thing, when you actually try to make it happen. So the idea of protection of biodiversity is an oftentimes discussed thing. We do a lot of this here. I'm involved with a project over on Maui at Oahu, where we're basically saving some of the last piece of the Hawaiian dry forest. to keep that biodiversity, though in many cases there's only maybe 5 or 10, members of that species of plant available anymore. So at some point, if you've only got 20 acres and there's five members of that species, how much biodiversity you actually have? And that, it gets into a real technical issue that you have to deal with a lot here in Hawaii. Because most of the Hawaiian Islands, especially Oahu, have no biodiversity for all intents and purposes. Between invasive species and the changes that people have made in the landscape for commodification, the biodiversity of this place is pretty much toast. And again, going back to sustainability, without biodiversity, the idea that you're going to have sustainability, because sustainability is over time. Sustainability doesn't mean you've got enough now. Sustainability means that you've got enough to keep something going. So it goes back to the idea of subsistence, which is over time. It's not a snapshot in a moment in time. So for that to be viable, biodiversity is obviously a critical factor. And how do you bring back biodiversity in a world like the island of Oahu that pretty much doesn't happen anymore? And that's something we're actually working with our Palolo project here. On preservation, this begins, of course, tied to biodiversity. If you preserve a species, for example, a species of animal in a zoo, how much preservation have you actually done? That isn't in the environment anymore. It's not in the world order. It's not in the biodiversity of even the environment it used to live in. So on one hand, you've saved it, but what is preservation? What's the goal of preservation? Because preservation is expensive. Preservation not only costs money to do, but in many cases, you're taking aside land and resources that could be used to make money, and you're using it to save things. And this becomes one of the huge issues about, do you save forests in the US mainland, or do you whack them? Do you keep, wolves around? Do you shoot them? All this stuff has to do with this idea both of biodiversity, but also the actual sort of cost-benefit analysis of preservation. Keeping a piece of intact forest in the Pacific Northwest means that you're not making money off of it. And if you really want to be good about preservation, you don't even allow people to go into it because they're going to disturb it by virtue of bringing in invasive species and stuff. So if no one can use it, no one can view it, you can't have tourists look at it, and you can't cut it down, then what's the value of it? And this is the Suzuki presentation that you'll see near the end of the semester has to do with this whole issue of biodiversity and preservation. And when you're looking at any environmental issue, all these just sort of, if you think about, they just all fold in together. Classic example, and the book actually has a really good example when they're talking about what we call slippers here, which I guess in the main they're called flip-flops. I thought they were called slippers, in terms of where stuff moves over time. And so when you're looking at this whole issue of landfill versus recycling, again, Oahu's a really good example. If you're being really good here, and you've got your bin that you throw stuff away, the dark bin, and then you've got your blue bin, which is for recyclables. The original intent of that was very good, that you take the recyclables, the cardboard, the glass, you crush them down, pack them up, and you ship them off to somewhere to be turned into something to be reused. And that's one of those, again, it's one of those things like sustainability. It just feels good. People think it's like the right stuff to do. You guys were probably brought up from the time you're in grade school, you're supposed to recycle. Well, the reality is recycling is a very complicated thing when you look at what we call the carbon footprint in terms of the actual track that something follows. So for example, if you buy something from Amazon, it comes over here in a box. So you've got your stuff from Amazon, you go fold the box up, put it in the blue bin, and the intent that you have and the understanding you have, because you have that bin for recyclables, is that the city and county, when they pick that up, will take it somewhere. They'll then bundle all this cardboard together and send it off somewhere to be then recycled somehow. The reality is recycling from an island is incredibly expensive and generally doesn't work. So years ago, what happened is the island of Oahu basically said, this ain't happening. And so now when you put that stuff in the blue bin, it all ends up being taken down to the H power plant and burned, turned as fuel. So it gets reused. I suppose to a certain extent, you might argue it gets recycled since it's turned into energy, but it's not packaged and reused as paper because it was just cost ineffective. It cost a lot more energy and a lot more pollution to package it up and send it to Vietnam or to China than it did to just burn it. So again, cost benefit analysis. So when you look at the whole issue of recycling, it's important to remember when people talk about recycling, you have to do, again, a cost benefit analysis. What's the actual total cost of recycling something? If you think about it, crushed glass, incredibly heavy. How much does it cost to take, 200 tons of crushed glass from the island of Oahu to, I don't know, hypothetically, we'll say a plant in California, which is 2,400 miles away. So you have the whatever the environmental costs are loading the glass onto a ship. You have the environmental cost of shipping it. You have the environmental cost of taking it off the ship and taking it wherever you're going to use it. You have the environmental cost of the heat and the other types of chemicals used to melt that glass down and turn it back into something. You know, at what point are you actually being environmentally responsible insisting on recycling? And this is one of the areas that gets very complicated because it gets back into this whole issue of truthing and the whole issue of sort of political ecology. So important to remember when you're looking at all this stuff, it's always, you know, as you've seen already in this semester, in geography, everything turns out to be a lot more complicated than it's oftentimes presented to the public. Because there's oftentimes almost everything's interrelated. There's manifold aspects, and what happens is people's perception tends to shape what they think they're doing. People here on the wall who are pretty good about the intent of recycling, but the reality is at some point we probably have to sit down and have a really serious discussion about what's the actual viability, what are the viable forms of recycling you can actually do. For example, maybe grinding up glass and putting it back, I have no idea, putting it back in the deep ocean might actually be more economically viable and actually more environmentally responsible than all the fossil fuel used to ship it to the mainland, the fossil fuel or hydroelectric or whatever type of power used to then heat it up, turn it into glass. You know, is that actually the best way to be environmentally responsible? And, you know, this people get really agitated about this stuff because it's a value thing. It's a perceptual thing. And so if you try to bring cost benefit analysis in, you know, some folks can get really aged out really, really fast. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have the discussion. It just means beware that doesn't mean everyone's going to be happy when you have that discussion.